The discussion tonight is going to be hitting the reset button on energy policy, a proposal for post-partisan power. It's a quadruple alliteration that's very impressive. Our three guests are here to talk about their ideas for moving our nation beyond polarizing politics and rhetoric and toward a sensible energy policy. In October, along with another author, they spelled out their ideas in a white paper titled Post-Partisan Power. Their paper received widespread attention in the media, in the Washington Post, and the New York Times. And I was especially interested in their work because it incorporates views from the left, the right, and the center, and because it re-examines entrenched notions. Two of the speakers, Michael Shellenberger and Ted Nordhaus, co-founded an environmental think tank, the Breakthrough Institute, in 2003 in Oakland, California. Our third speaker, Steve Hayward, is the F.K. Weyerhaeuser Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. A fourth co-author of the paper, Mark Murrow of the Brookings Institution, couldn't join us today. The centerpiece of their proposal is that America can make clean energy cheap. Among other things, their paper calls on the left to drop its obsession with carbon caps. They argue for a technology-neutral approach that funds all low-carbon technologies from nuclear to solar to biofuels. They also call on the right to drop its opposition to increased federal investment in innovation. In fact, their proposal calls for increasing federal government spending on energy innovation to $25 billion a year, many times where it is today. Before we begin, let me tell you a little bit about our speakers. Michael Shellenberg, on my left here, is president of the Breakthrough Institute, while Ted Nordhaus, on the other side, is the organization's chairman. In 2004, they co-authored a controversial essay, The Death of Environmentalism, that was a manifesto for change that criticized the American environmental movement for relying on the complaint-based interest group liberalism of the 60s and 70s. In the era of global warming, they argued, doom and gloom rhetoric and old-school methods cannot achieve the broad social and ecological transformations that America and the world need. That essay generated vociferous reactions from the nation's established environmental groups and led them to be labeled the bad boys of environmentalism. The debate that ensued has continued in both the popular press and academia. The essay that generated this debate, I should note, also was the genesis of their book, Breakthrough, From the Death of Environmentalism to the Politics of Possibility. And we have copies back there that are for sale at the end of this talk. I might mention that Michael was here back in 2007 when he was promoting the book, and the fact that it's still on sale is a good thing. At least it hasn't been remaindered as far as I know. Time magazine called Breakthrough prescient for its prediction that pollution regulations could not transform the global economy. Wired magazine said that the book could be the most important thing to happen to environmentalism since Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. The book expanded on ideas presented in their 2004 essay, which generated a national debate in the pages of the New York Times and around the country. For their work, Shellenberg and Nordhaus were named Time magazine's Heroes of the Environment in 2008. Michael received his BA from Earlham College and a master's degree in cultural anthropology from the University of California. Ted is an author, researcher, and political strategist. Over the last 20 years, he's run major campaigns and initiatives for a long assortment of environmental and progressive political causes, including the public interest research groups, the Sierra Club, Environmental Defense, and Clean Water Action. He holds a BA in history from the University of California at Berkeley. Steve Hayward is the F.K. Weyerhaeuser Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and is also a senior fellow at the Pacific Research Institute. He's the author of the Almanac of Environmental Trends and contributes to AEI's Energy and Environmental Outlook series. In addition to many other books on environmental topics, he's written biographies of Presidents Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan, and even one of Winston Churchill. He has a PhD in American Studies. Today's presentation is part of the Sanford School's continuing series of talks on the topic of political gridlock and what we can do about it. To join in that conversation, visit the Gridlock blog, which you can find easily on the Sanford homepage. I think they're going to interact with each other for 30 or 40 minutes, and then open up Q's and A's to the audience. And I think there's a mic down here and there's one upstairs if people have questions that they want to ask, but please keep your questions until the end. And when you do ask them, please just ask questions, although I'm sure they're willing to entertain some debate.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thanks very much. Well, thanks, Bruce. And it's really a pleasure to be here and to be introduced by you especially because I think at least I first met Bruce at a conference in Montana sponsored by a group of libertarian environmentalists where we sort of spent several days arguing about climate change, energy policy, the role of the state in sort of technological change. And that was really where a whole set of the conversations and arguments started that Michael and I started having with Steve in particular that really almost 3 years later led to the Post-Partisan Power proposal, which was really a product of what Steve likes to call the process of achieving disagreement, the sort of the highest objective of debate in the sense that in achieving disagreement, then you can also sort of figure out how you might move forward, where you agree, where there's some consensus. So it's really a pleasure to be introduced by Bruce, to be here at the school. I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of the kind of larger framework that I think the three of us largely sort of share that really kind of then led to some of the sort of specific ideas that we put out together with Mark Murrow from the Brookings Institution on how we might move forward on energy and climate policy sort of after what has really been the crash of the sort of long-standing effort led by the national environmental movement to establish a cap on carbon emissions and in that way drive a transition to a clean energy economy. And really, I think if you wanted to get to the sort of heart of why we think that strategy has failed, and we would go beyond why we think the climate strategy has failed, but when you look at the sort of 40-year history of failed promises around things like energy independence and getting off of foreign or Middle Eastern oil, why those efforts have failed as well, it is because we have sort of consistently put the policy horse, I should say the policy cart, in front of the technology horse. The assumption being that there are a whole set of measures that if we take them, the sort of technologies that we need either already exist or will sort of magically materialize once we've sort of established the political determination to do it, or once we've set emissions targets, or once we have a price on carbon. There are sort of multiple strands of this kind of magical thinking about where the technologies that we need are going to come from. Our view is that the reality is that we do not have the technology today to either get off of oil, foreign oil, much less to achieve deep reductions in U.S. or global carbon emissions. And there are a series of reasons for that. The first just being that against sort of a lot of the arguments that have been made for several decades in what's been called the soft energy path, the reality is that the world is going to use much more energy. And that will be the case even if we use energy much more efficiently than we have today. The second is that fossil fuels are quite extraordinary fuel sources. They are energy dense, they are easy to transport, they are easy to dispatch, you can turn them on and off whenever you want. And that the alternatives, by and large, are none of those things. They are costly, they are not dense, they are intermittent, and they create a whole set of economic, have a whole host of economic and technological challenges that have prevented their widespread commercialization or deployment. And this is despite several decades of quite substantial support and subsidy for those technologies in the US and throughout the developed world particularly. So for all of those reasons, our view would be that the kind of conventional paradigm for how you deal with the climate crisis has failed and will continue to fail until you deal fundamentally with the technological problem. Now, you know, the sort of the reply to this has been that, well, yeah, that might be true, but in response to the proper, either depending on the view, regulatory or price incentives, the private sector will solve this problem. With price on carbon, we'll go innovate, and we'll go sort of create or improve the technologies we have such that they can actually meet our needs. And we would just point out that this is sort of inconsistent with pretty much the entire history of energy innovation, which has largely not been driven by private firms and markets responding to price signals, or for that matter, to regulatory mandates, but in fact has been driven by direct public and largely supply side as opposed to demand side measures to actually deploy new energy technologies. And on some level this may seem counterintuitive, but it's really not. You know, if what you want is new energy technologies, the most effective and direct way to get them is to go build them. And when we look around the world, those policies haven't always succeeded as well as we would like, but whether it's nuclear power in the United States, France, Sweden, and elsewhere, you know, solar, to the degree to which we've made progress on solar power or wind or any of the alternatives to fossil fuels, it has almost entirely been driven by direct state support for energy supply technologies. So our view then is that, you know, if you actually want to deal with this problem, you have to deal with it in the way that we've deployed energy technologies like this in the past, A. B, we also, though, don't think that just subsidizing existing technologies is going to solve that problem. You know, the other sort of theory has been, well, if you just go deploy a whole lot of solar or wind, you get enough scale, it'll get cheaper. And that's true. The price has come down, but it hasn't come down nearly enough. Wind power in the United States still costs about 50% more than coal and gas after 30 years of state support here and around the world. Solar costs 3 to 5 times as much. So simply kind of doing what we call dumb deployment isn't going to work to drive those costs down to the point that they're going to be widely commercialized and deployed anytime soon. I will conclude with a couple things and then turn it over to Michael to sort of lay out more specifically some of the key concepts in this post-partisan power proposal that we've put together. You know, the first is that stepping away from the climate question, there are a whole set of other benefits to what we call energy modernization and to energy technology innovation. Obviously, there are national security benefits, particularly with regard to oil. There are big economic benefits if you actually can develop technologies that can compete, you know, directly without subsidies with existing fossil fuel technologies, particularly in a world where population, you know, is growing from 6 billion today to 9 billion by 2050, and we're going to need vastly more energy, including for the sort of roughly 2 billion people around the world today who have no access still to modern energy services. Pollution benefits, just conventional pollution benefits, forget about climate change for the moment and just think about air pollution, other pollution impacts. So lots of other reasons, and that, you know, as opposed to the climate debate, where what we have essentially been trying to do is to get political economies to pay very real costs in the present for what are still fairly uncertain benefits well off in the future, often for future generations, that we need to better align the benefits of climate and energy policy and the costs in the present. Obviously, a lot of the focus of post-partisan power has been around really focusing on delivering immediate benefits in terms of energy innovation, economic, national security, and conventional pollution benefits by modernizing our energy technologies at sort of what are really sort of fairly modern, modest costs for the U.S. Economy today. And our view is that that is really the starting point for kind of resetting the energy and climate debate and resetting energy and climate policy in a way where we can start to make some progress. So on that note, I'll turn it over to Michael.
Great, thanks, Ted, and thanks everybody for coming, and also want to thank Dean Kunigholm for inviting us out. I was here 4 years ago and was very impressed by the quality of the conversation, so we're looking forward to having a lot of Q&A. Wanted to say beforehand, too, that our motivation in coming here is in large measure to recruit graduate students and the exceptional undergraduate student for our summer fellowship program at the Breakthrough Institute. We actually have these flyers on that back table over there. It's a great program. We accept about 6 to 10 fellows each summer. It's a paid fellowship. It's pretty competitive. We had about 500 applicants last summer, but it's an intense program. We do about a 2-week boot camp on energy policy and climate, and then we spend the rest of the summer working on various reports and projects. And so our fellows have produced a whole set of very good papers, including one on the history of American technology innovation called Where Good Technologies Come From, which is actually an example on the back table, and also did a lot of the foundational kind of policy research for Post-Partisan Power, which is the report that we're talking about here, and which I will describe in brief. And before going there, Ted mentioned that our view has been, ever since we wrote Death of Environmentalism, that we needed an energy policy that would bring Americans together regardless of whether they thought global warming was a significant problem or even something that was created by humans. And so there are a lot of different reasons, as Ted mentioned, to support accelerating the move away from fossil fuels. I mean, about 2,000 people die every year in coal mining accidents. About 2 million die from air pollution. When we talk with our conservative friends, those are big motivations, as well as our continued dependence on imported foreign oil, which is a big challenge big problem with our trade deficit, and arguably makes us vulnerable in terms of our national security. One other kind of sense of scale here, if one of your key concerns is global warming, in order to reach what the United Nations IPCC says we should try to do, which is to have 450 parts per million of carbon in the atmosphere or less, you would need to deploy a huge quantity of low-carbon energy primary power between now and 2050. In fact, the calculation everybody agrees on, both our friends and people that we've had disagreements with over the years, the estimate is about 1 gigawatt of nuclear power would have to be deployed every day. These are nuclear plants which we haven't built in the United States for over 30 years. It takes years to build a 1 gigawatt power plant. That's enough power to power a city of about 1 million people, and you'd have to build 1 of those a day. So our point is that you're not going to come anywhere close to moving away from fossil fuels, much less deploying that much technology, until you can get a whole radical levels of innovation in terms of reducing the price of low carbon power and also making it much more scalable. Post-partisan power sort of begins by saying we need to make energy innovation a priority. Right now, it's really not the priority of American energy policy, as surprising as that might be given how much attention there's been for energy innovation over the years. I mean, the Department of Energy mostly exists to manage our nuclear arsenal. That was the purpose of its creation. We spent a pittance on energy R&D. I think we spent about a little bit more than $3 billion a year The dog food industry spends more on R&D than the entire U.S. Nation spends on energy R&D. The pharmaceutical company Amgen spends more money on energy R&D, just that one company, than does the entire United States. As a consequence, what you find is that in pharmaceuticals, the industry spends about 25% of its revenues on R&D. And that's not a coincidence. It's in large part because the U.S. taxpayers spend about $32 billion on energy R&D. What you find historically is that governments lead that charge towards innovation. The government makes those initial investments and the private sector follows because we are making a set of investments that the private sector simply can't make because they can't recoup those investments in basic research. Another example is the information technology industry. Computers spend about 15% of their total revenues on R&D. That's in large measure due to the fact that we spend about $80 billion a year on defense R&D spending that has been going on obviously since the 1950s. All of the basic technologies in your iPhone, and our report, Where Good Technologies Come From, sort of describe this. All the basic technologies in your iPhone come from military R&D and innovation over the last 50 years. Steve Jobs did a great job bringing all those technologies and packaging them into the iPhone, but that basic work required those shared investments. The view of post-partisan power is that we really don't have an innovation strategy at all. We have subsidies for basically all kinds of energy technologies, and we see some innovation come out of it, but it's not nearly as an intelligent of a portfolio as it could be. And we sometimes hear from our environmental friends, well, that's because all the subsidies are going to fossil fuels. In fact, we just did an analysis that found that 6 times more subsidies go to renewables in the United States, measured on a per kilowatt basis, than go to fossil energy. And the strategy is basically we're just going to subsidize all of it. And in that sense, it looks a lot more like farm subsidies than it does look like the kind of innovation that the U.S. military has been very adept at. So post-partisan power really consists of 4 pieces, and I'll walk through them for everybody briefly. And again, you can download a copy of the report online, or you can read the New York Times and Washington Post's endorsements of post-partisan power where they describe it. But basically, it consists of 4 things. The first is a big increase in the amount of money that we spend on basic energy research, and also a big increase in the amount of money that we spend on energy scholarships, energy fellowships. So those of you that do energy engineering or energy sciences, we want to see a lot more money going into that work, that postgraduate work, that fellowship work, that scholarship, to be training the next generation of energy engineers. One of my best friends is an oil industry engineer, does very high-tech geophysical magnetic resonancing of oil. That's about all I know about it, by the way, just that word I said. And he would love to be doing clean tech, but there's not really a place that he could go that would have somebody at his level of expertise. So we want to have a big increase in how much money we spend in basic science and education. The second piece is that we want to reform how we do energy subsidies right now. Our view is that we should be buying advanced energy technologies rather than subsidizing the production of more of the same old solar panels, wind turbines, batteries. The model here is, again, from the military. When you see, when I was here 4 years ago, I mentioned that one of the most impressive cases of innovation in the 20th century was microchips, where they, around the time Sputnik launched, microchips cost about $1,000 a chip. And there was really no market for them. In less than a decade, the Defense Department had bought so many microchips and was demanding better and better microchips that the price came down to $20 a chip. And I think a lot of people misread that story, and they think, well, that means we just have to buy a lot of solar panels. The truth is that when the DoD is buying something, they are actually a very demanding customer. So we've all been kind of brainwashed a little bit about this, that the Defense Department are really stupid and they just spend too much money on toilet seats and hammers. The truth is that often what the DoD is doing is that they are purchasing next generation technologies. They're going to pay more for them, but they're going to buy those advanced technologies knowing that they're going to be driving that innovation and that those technologies are going to be dual use. And there's always been a sense that those dual use technologies, and of course it's been proven through the last 40 years in terms of the IT revolution. So we want to see a model shift from just subsidizing the old to purchasing the new, borrowing from that military procurement model. The third piece of it is we want to really bump up the amount of money that we spend in R&D. This is beyond basic science. So our Brookings colleague who couldn't come, he actually has to do real work, not just travel around the country and talk about these ideas. They've pioneered what are called sort of energy innovation hubs, 2 of which the DOE have already put into place, but they haven't had enough funding to do the rest. The idea comes from land grant colleges on agriculture, phenomenally successful model where we funded universities to work with local farmers, to work with laboratories, to work with seed companies, and what you've seen is an astonishing improvement in agricultural output, so much so that food is incredibly cheap, and we now have a global obesity problem rather than a global hunger problem. But all of the predictions in the late 60s that population would outstrip supply, all of those things were proven wrong because we were able to use these methodologies of accelerating seed, fertilizer, and other technologies and increase agricultural output. That model is the right model here because what you're trying to do is get what innovation scholars called really liquid, fluid networks in between universities, venture capitalists, utilities who are going to be purchasing these things, private energy firms. You want everybody working together and sharing ideas, and you've got to have a budget to support that. So the idea is eventually to go up to something more like 20 or 40 of those hubs. You might have a special solar hub, for example, in New Mexico. You might have a special nuclear hub here in the South where you don't have as many renewables. But the idea being, let's really decentralize a lot of that innovation. The final piece of it is that it was very important to us that this proposal pay for itself. We're proposing that the annual budget be somewhere between 15 and 25 billion a year. Again, that's a big increase over the existing 3 billion that we spend today. And we offer a set of ways to pay for it. And the idea here is that we want to internalize within the energy system the cost of innovation. So we've heard a lot about, well, we want to internalize in the price of energy the cost of pollution. That's not what we're trying to do with this proposal. We're trying to internalize the cost of the innovation program. So you might, depending on how you view the global warming or how you view oil independence, you might think that we need a price on carbon that's somewhere between $50 or $150 a ton. That's not what we're trying to do. We're just trying to raise enough money from within the energy system to pay for 15 to 25 billion a year. So as you might imagine, the cost and the ways to pay for it are going to be so low that consumers, companies are not even going to notice it. So we propose 4 different ways to pay for this investment. The first is subsidy reform. Do we really need to be spending $4 billion a year continuing to subsidize wind turbines, which are not really changing in terms of their basic technology, very mature technology? Do we really need to keep subsidizing corn ethanol production? If we're going to be making those investments in biofuels, shouldn't we be buying advanced technologies? So one of the key important ways is subsidy reform. The second is a very small fee on electricity generation, what's called a wires fee. It's actually something that's been championed by Duke Energy as a way to pay for R&D. Very small, again, most customers would not even see the difference on their energy bills. The third is some sort of a fee on oil imports. There's obviously a set of disadvantages with having so much imported foreign oil on the economy. Again, a very small fee on those imports. And then finally, a very low carbon price. So again, instead of a carbon price that's looking to internalize the externality of global warming, you're looking at a very low carbon price. If the carbon price alone paid for the whole project, it would be less than $5 per ton of CO2. That's about a third or a fourth of how much the cap-and-trade legislation was proposing to be. In fact, our whole proposal was estimated by the New York Times economics columnist David Leonhardt at being somewhere around half or maybe a third as expensive as the cap-and-trade legislation that failed in the last Congress. So with that, I'll stop and I'll turn over to my colleague Steve Hayward to finish it up, and then hopefully we'll have time for a lot of questions and discussion.
Well, since this is a forum organized around the Gridlock Project, I'll say a little bit about the perspective of someone who is a certified card-carrying member of the vast right-wing conspiracy, and probably at least half a climate skeptic, although it makes me as odd as a monarchist, I suppose, these days. I don't spend much time worrying about all the rest of that because, for a couple of reasons. One is uncertainty cuts both directions. And second, there are ancillary reasons to be intensely interested in the energy question. The one's already been mentioned is national security, but there are general reasons having to do with the world's energy needs over a long horizon that make it in the interest of a nation and the world as a whole to be ahead of the curve as far as possible on what I like to call the master resource, meaning energy. If you don't have energy, most other things that you want to do become a whole lot more difficult. The story of our collaboration came about because I read Michael and Ted's book. And I should say that I've been, something of a critic of environmentalism and the environmental movement for a long time, and have the classic conservative criticisms of a lot of environmental regulation. I like to say that the EPA specializes in billion-dollar solutions to million-dollar problems. But that's true of a lot of government agencies, not just to pick on the EPA. And on the other hand, too, I have for a long time, and have written a number of articles about how it has been catastrophic for the environment, rightly understood, I think, that you have this estrangement from conservatives who ought to be for conservation, since the same root word is in both, right? And who, by the way, were fairly enthusiastic about environmental regulation in the early days of the late 60s and early 70s. Most people don't remember from that time, and don't know if you're younger, that one of the chief co-sponsors of the Endangered Species Act was William F. Buckley's brother, who was a one-term senator from New York, he's still alive, still defends the act, saying it hasn't really unfolded the way I had in mind, but I still am for having that act. So what you've seen in recent years is this complete estrangement where conservatives like to make jokes about the tastiness of spotted owls, and most environmental groups have reciprocated by claiming it as a sort of a left-wing issue. And as I say, that's a problem because most serious policy progress in this country, in fact, strike that, I'll say all serious policy change in this country has to happen on some kind of a bipartisan basis. I think you see part of the problems of the health care reform debate is that it didn't go that way. Unlike Social Security, Medicare, even welfare reform in various times, really did happen on a much more bipartisan basis. So I read Ted and Michael's book, and I thought, here are two guys who are, to use the cliche, thinking outside the box about environmental issues. I didn't agree with all parts of the book, but I actually pitched National Review magazine, William F. Buckley's magazine, to review it. They're not really interested in many environmental books, but I said, here's one that people should read and pay attention to because it's self-critical of environmentalism with serious thought about how you would do it differently. So I wrote a mostly positive review in National Review, and then I think maybe to Michael and Ted's surprise, we never met yet, Jonathan Adler, who's a very libertarian law professor in Ohio, wrote a positive review of the book in the Wall Street Journal. And meanwhile, I noticed online that most of the liberal journals, like the American Prospects, were dumping all over the book, seemingly without reading it or engaging it very seriously. And I thought, Michael and Ted must be wondering what's gone upside down in the world, that they're getting praise from National Review and the Wall Street Journal and given the back of the hand from their liberal peeps. So from that, first were emails and then coffee, and then, as I like to put it, how did it come that at the very end of the day you come up with an energy plan, a Post-Partisan Power that I sign on to, and then also has Mark Moreau from the Brookings Institution, which is sort of more center, mild liberal. And Ted talked about one aspect of it. I think in one of our first meetings, I'll give the whole quote, as I like to quote the late Jesuit philosopher John Courtney Murray, that on contentious issues like this, sometimes the most useful thing is to achieve disagreement. Achieve disagreement, because he went on to say, a lot of times what looks like disagreement is merely confusion. And so it's useful to understand the serious reasons why you might disagree about an idea. And so in the area of sort of energy innovation, energy policy, the basic conservative response is, look, the government's just going to screw it up. The government seldom does better than the marketplace does, or is not very good at picking winners, or is susceptible to a whole line of some of the public choice objections about how it'll end up being crony capitalism or subsidizing the insiders and so forth. And Michael and Ted took those criticisms to heart, and in return, what I took to heart from them was examples of where the government has done innovation well. Michael's mentioned a few examples. I've spent some time sort of independently of them, looking at the NIH and the role it's played in the pharmaceutical industry. As I say, Michael referred to that. That's a really interesting story. Not without mistakes, not without wastes of money, but I'm not a believer that I'm a believer that the perfect is the enemy of the good. And in fact, I'm a believer that if you're not making some mistakes and not wasting some money, you're not actually taking enough risks and not being bold enough. So that's how this process went. And then the codicil I add to all that is that, again, Ted sort of alluded to this, and I wrote this up in an article recently, partly as a reaction to this whole no labels movement. Everyone says, let's just get together and sing Kumbaya. And I said, no, our example really shows how it's done, and it's patient argument. Ted said debate. I'd actually make a distinction between debate and argument. Debate is sort of what happens on the cable news channels, or used to until they polarize in their own little camps, right? But argument is what I was saying earlier. Let's really sit down and spend a day, and we spent many days in person, on the phone and conference calls, sending emails with this article to look at and that technical article to look at, where we sort of work through these questions. And as I say, persuade each other about things. Because the truth is except for cranks, and there's lots of cranks across the spectrum, nobody's against clean energy, depending on how you define clean. Define it broadly if you want. Nobody's against, nobody is really for destroying the environment in one way or another, except again for cranks. So that leaves a lot of room for serious argument when people have time for it. That kind of argument does take time. And there's going to be lots of other environmental problems, by the way, where this model is going to be necessary. I think about the kinds of things that, where we really don't have a good handle on making progress, like I call the second wave of water pollution. The old wave of trying to clamp down on stationary sources, that works reasonably well. But the real problem now is runoff from farm fields and streets and roads, and the old model of a rulemaking and regulators trying to get after all the different diffuse sources, that's not going to work very well. We're making very slow progress. The problem of biodiversity, both on a national and a global scale, is another one that defies a sort of programmatic remedy, it seems to me. And so that's, to my mind, and I'll conclude with this, is one of the most important lessons or challenges out of this effort is, Michael and Ted don't quite put it this way, but I do. In saying that solving the problem of energy means we have to have essentially an energy revolution that no one can quite see how that's going to unfold. This is asking the environmental movement to think in a new way that I think is deeply uncomfortable. It's challenging environmentalists, and we've been to see a lot of them. They come to see me now independently because they seem to think I'm, must be different from the usual conservative, which I suppose is true. But, the older model of environmentalism from, say, the 70s was an emphasis on a regulatory framework and legislation, timetables, targets, and that gave you a degree of certainty. We knew what the target was going to be under the Clean Air Act for ozone, and you knew what the rulemaking was going to be, and there was a sequence for all that, and there'd be the usual frictions, but that pathway was fairly clear. And as I say, that is the old model that, and part of what we're saying is that approach was never going to work for the climate change problem. In fact, I think one of the phrases that Michael and Ted use in their book that I thought was so good was, how did you guys put it, that greenhouse gas emissions are to traditional air pollution what nuclear weapons is to gang warfare. Isn't that how you put it? Mm-hmm. Street gangs, something like that. I think that's exactly right. But it is for an environmental establishment that has been so used to the old model and right now is embracing the fallback position of the Clean Air Act. It is asking them to give up some old, maybe comfortable is not the right word, but some old certitudes about the way they viewed the world and how it would work, and embrace a strategy that is more open-ended, more uncertain, and that is a hard thing to, I understand that. That is a hard thing to ask the environmental community to do, and I think that accounts for at least some of the friction that you guys have experienced. And some of the reason why we are now starting on round 2, which is, okay, here's our framework, but now the particular question that I've been raising is, all right, if we're going to have these energy innovation hubs and some other things, how do we keep these stupid congressmen from getting their paws into it and screwing it up, right? And there are some ideas for that, like one model from the 90s is the Base Closure Commission model might work. But I think I will stop there, and I don't know if you guys want to add anything or respond to any of my provocations or not, but anyway, I'll look forward to questions and comments from the audience.
All right, so there are mics down here and up the top, and you should feel free to line up and ask questions, not be shy. They're inviting comment, criticism, so please.
No one ever wants to ask the first question
or
anything. It's just, right.
It'll happen. There we go. The rest of you may want to think about stepping up. Please also state your name and ask your question, and you can ask them of any one of them or all of them, however you want.
Okay. My name is Kent Trucor. I'm with the Nicholas School of Environment and the Fuqua School of Business here at Duke. I'd like to thank you for coming out this evening and speaking with us. Yeah. The question I have is reading through your guys' report, there's actually 2 questions. The first one is, what has the reception been of industry to this as well as policymakers? And the second question is, in going through the different ways of paying for this, I noticed you guys put in the $4 to $5 fee or tax, if you will, on carbon. And in this country, that could be designated as a toxic word. So I wanted to get your guys elaborate on that as well.
Sure. Well, I'll dive into the last part first. I mean, I think the first thing to say is, our expectation was not that we were going to write the report and that the next Congress would just pass it, I think our view is that this stuff takes time, and that we actually need to go and continue to have the argument both on the left and the right. And we got mostly positive responses from both sides, but also negative responses, critical responses that we have to deal with. Just as a set of context, cap and trade as a proposal was basically advocated for 20 years. I mean, really intensively over the last 10. It came in before the Senate about 4 times. Each time it failed, really had less support each time. We calculate, just on the back of the envelope, the environmental movement spent $1 or $2 billion trying to get cap and trade passed. So I think we think, if they would just give us about half of that, we might be able to move something a little sooner. I mean, kidding aside, I think we've been impressed that innovation remains an important part of the conversation. I think everyone expects Obama will make it a big part of his talk tonight. I think, for conservatives, like Steve said, it's like you can't find conservatives who are against energy innovation. What you have is a great deal of skepticism that energy innovation can be accelerated by the government, and I think some of that is not just a partisan ideological problem. Some of that is just the genuine historical amnesia that exists in this country. I mean, really, we haven't, most of us don't feel like we depend very much on the government. We feel like the government takes more than it gives back. We think our technologies come from Apple and Google. We don't know that DARPA invented the internet. We did this, again, that report where good technologies comes from. We look at many, if not most, of the big blockbuster drugs, pharmaceutical drugs, the last 20 years depended on that initial federal funding. So I think we've got our work cut out for us in terms of kind of making that case. I think the second thing I'd just say about it is that, our view is that really when Congress makes its mind up to do something, it finds the funding. That really the right order for this is for us to make the case for it. We lay out some ideas about where the money could come from, but it's really something that policymakers will figure out. And we're still at the early stages, so I think we need a little bit more. Give us a few more years, and hopefully we'll make a little bit more progress. And I don't know if either of you want to.
Yeah, well, I'll just add a little bit. I mean, it's to echo a little bit with embroider what Michael said. Is most new policy strategy shifts don't happen full-blown real fast. They take a while, whether it's welfare reform, which had, its enthusiasts from both left-wing versions and right-wing versions, and that took a long time for that to unfold, and other things you can point to. So, yeah, we want to play the long game on this. And so some of the industry reaction has been sort of typical and disappointing. It's how can this benefit our industry? They sort of think of it in the conventional beltway way, and that's very frustrating. What I found from the conservative side is, a spectrum of reactions, which is a certain degree of openness, partly because I have some credibility with most conservatives who know me and know my work. A couple of sort of libertarian groups have said, well, we don't think very much of this, but at least it's modest. It's not promising the moon, and it's not spending $100 billion a year. The funniest reaction has been about paying for it. And my argument is that, look, if Congress has to pay for something for a change, they're less likely to do it unless they're convinced that, there's no more deficits. Partly it's a concession to the fiscal reality we're in, but also it's an act of sort of responsibility. You're going to tell Congress you got to pay for something. And I sort of think of it as like the highway, the gasoline tax for highways. You link, as Michael said, link the research program to the sector that's involved in. And that brings me to the carbon tax. I find a lot of people don't even know what a wires charge is. But the carbon tax, and I've had some people scream at me saying, we work so hard to kill cap and trade, and you want to bring back a carbon tax? And I remind them it's a revenue measure, not a change the market measure, to reiterate what Michael said. And second, if you want the energy sector to bear the burden of innovating for that sector, isn't a carbon tax better than an oil import fee, which is going to hit the oil sector? And the wires charge is mostly, that gets a little bit of coal, but the carbon tax is the most equitable tax because that will, if you do an oil import fee, then coal gets completely off the hook, right? And so you want a tax that's most broad-based. So that usually sort of ends the argument with some grumbling. But then environmentalists, by the way, they're disappointed that the carbon tax is so small. And I make this, it's not a tax to change the market. It's a tax to raise revenue to pay for something. They don't get it either, see? So it's, because they hear carbon tax, they think, oh, good, we're back in business. These guys are going to help us out. They say, no, sorry to let you down on that. This is just to pay for something.
I would just add one other thing on the carbon tax, carbon price issue, which is that really what you saw as the sort of congressional climate legislation evolved was sort of the worst of both worlds. You had a carbon price that was high enough to generate very substantial sort of opposition, regional economic impacts, all sorts of things like that, but actually not high enough to actually have much impact on emissions or the deployment of low carbon alternatives. That strikes me as kind of the worst possible outcome and the least sustainable outcome you could get. So.
Yeah, and actually, one thing we did forget to add is that we have actually had a set of conversations, we can't say yet with who, but with a set of folks in the energy industry who are actually quite interested in this. I think for them, they are looking like everybody else is as to what comes next now that cap and trade is dead in the water.
I'll give the next question up there, and then the following one down here.
Yeah, hi, thank you for coming. I just want to get a little bit of clarification on the point that you made that we can really take sort of the long route. We almost as if time is on our side. We can convince lawmakers slowly. And I've heard various discourse that says, look, we've got to move on this right now, or else it's a doomsday scenario.
End.
And China is having a first mover advantage and going into clean energy technology, and that's going to shape their dominance over us in the 21st century. You hear all sorts of variants of the story. What would you say to that? Why do we have time on our side?
Well, I think whether or not we have time on our side, rhetorically is sort of an irrelevant question. I mean, frankly, on the climate stuff, we have been hearing that we don't have time for any of these other things. We just have to cap it and reduce it, and we've got, pick your number, 4 years or 8 years or 10 years, and after that it's irreversible and the world's going to end. And I would just point out that that view and those kinds of arguments have have basically justified a strategy, which is hard caps on emissions, that has failed for 2 decades. And at some point, you start to kind of wonder if this is really about reducing emissions at all, you know, versus sort of moralizing about the end of the world. Because, you know, the determination to pursue the same failed strategy again and again and again, the enormous amount of resources poured into that strategy at that point. I mean, Michael mentioned $1 billion to $2 billion. We think that just over the last 2 years, the environmental movement and environmental philanthropy spent probably north of $1 billion. So at some point, you got to go like, shut up already about how we don't have time to do anything else, because you've been saying that for 20 years and you haven't gotten anything done, and let's try to get something done that, you know, actually has some progress of moving us forward. And that really is the starting point for our basic proposition on post-partisan power. And, you know, we've heard, you know, we've gotten, Steve mentioned sort of some of the reactions from the sort of libertarian right, sort of attacking the idea that government should have anything to do with any of this. And then, of course, the attacks on the other side have really come from the sort of self-described, you know, climate hawk community, which seems kind of determined to just kind of, it's more interesting to sort of berate the rest of us about how much time we don't have than to actually sort of reconsider how we're going to get where we need to go. So,
just if I add a quick comment on China. I'm a little cynical about what China's up to. I think there's 2 things going on there. One is they want every electron they can possibly get. But so when you actually add up what they're going to do, yeah, they're going to build a lot of solar and wind, but they're going to build a whole lot more coal and nuclear and probably natural gas. But second, the cynical part really is I think they're looking out at us and the Europeans, at least they were 2, 3 years ago, maybe still today, and saying, well, gee, if all those countries are going to want to put up windmills and solar panels, we'll make them for them. They're building another export market for themselves, I think, which may be smart business.
Okay, next.
Hi, I'm Allison from the Nicholas School of the Environment as well, and I read your post-partisan power plan and was especially interested in the role that you discussed for the Defense Department in driving sort of energy innovation. I was just wondering if you could expand on that a little bit and what your theories were on what has been holding them back. Why haven't they been achieving that role, even though it seems like it's a strategic role for them?
Well, I mean, I think I'll just jump in with one thing, and my colleagues may have more to say. I mean, I think the first thing to understand about the success of the DoD is that they spend so much money on technology. You know, I mean, I think, you know, what we know about the history of innovation is that failures and accidents are actually quite important to technological progress. I mean, we all know the famous penicillin examples, the telephone. I mean, we have we know that actually you require. So what you hear in Silicon Valley from inventors is that you want to increase the failure rate. That failure is actually part of it, and so is waste. I mean, you know, like we don't know in advance what's going to work and what's not going to work. You know, it's like the famous you know, advertising consultant who kind of comes back and he goes, well, we looked at it and we figured out that half of your advertising is working. Problem is we don't know which half. So I mean, part of it is that DoD has just been spending a lot of money on these technologies and been doing it for 50 years. So you've had an enormous, you know, enormous amount of failure and an enormous amount of success. I think, you know, in terms of energy, you know, the DoD has very specific needs. They need to you know, reduce the cost of getting fuel to frontline troops. You know, you know, when they look at, you know, various biofuels or whatever, it has to have a military. It has to sort of have, for it to be dual use, it has to have some military purpose and function to it. So, you know, one of the things that we have looked at is, you know, could you get some of these smaller and much safer advanced nuclear reactors deployed on U.S. military bases? And are there places for kind of some synergies there? And certainly the military's been interested in it. But they've just never had this as their mandate, no more than the DOE has had it as theirs. I don't know if you guys want to jump in on it.
Well, I will just add one thought that early on in our process, and we learned some interesting new things just this morning about this, is the DOD's been building small nuclear reactors for their submarines and aircraft carriers, you know, for years, right? And they're exempt from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. They get to do this on their own. And one of the problems with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission is it's a typical path-dependent bureaucracy. They've been organized forever and sort of been dormant all these years around the old-fashioned big light water reactors. And if you tell them, you know, the industry, the engineers say, we have a whole new generation of 3 or 4 different kind of reactors, they'll scratch their head and say, it's going to take us 5 years to think of a process to review that and license it. Right. So our idea is, let's just go around that problem. If you actually build 10 or 20 or whatever number through the defense process, and here they are, they work, then you short-circuit that whole problem. But someone was telling us today that the Department of Defense also has its bureaucratic inertia, and they tend not to like to, it's one thing to build a reactor for an aircraft carrier. It's another one to build it as their power plant for Camp Pendleton or somewhere, or Camp Lejeune, since we're in North Carolina. And they don't like to build dual-use technology that's not quickly licensable by the NRC or whatever regulatory framework they're in. So there's bureaucratic resistance at Department of Defense to our idea.
Okay, is there anybody up there? Yeah.
Hi, I'm Katie. I'm an undergrad. Thanks for coming. I just had a question about what you had said before about how investing in wind and solar was like, or current wind and solar technologies was maybe like a dumb idea, and I wanted you to maybe elaborate on how are we supposed to know what new things to invest in, like which one of those are dumb ideas and which one of those actually has the possibility to be cost effective. Like how are you supposed to know that the learning curve is basically?
Well, yeah, I mean, our view is that you need to discipline. I mean, you talk about investing in solar and wind. Well, what we're doing is we have very, you know, these are above-cost technologies that we have fairly significant, certainly if you calculate them on the sort of kilowatt hour of energy they generate, subsidies to incentivize, various, utilities and other private sector and individuals who want to put solar panels on their house, whatever, to buy these things and use them. Our view is that if you're going to kind of continue to subsidize those or any of these other above-cost energy technologies, you have to discipline that process with demonstrated declines in the cost. In other words, if our ability to subsidize a technology like solar PV that is 3, 4, 5 times as much as electricity generated from a coal or gas-fired power plant is pretty limited. We're not going to be able to pay for that much of it, or we're unlikely to. So the thing that you have to do is really use those subsidies in a different way to sort of drive that innovation and discipline it by demonstrated reductions in the cost of the technology. So as opposed to the current sort of idea around deployment, which is that we will, if we just deploy a whole lot of it, we'll get these economies of scale and the price will come down. Michael mentioned a study from one of our senior fellows, Greg Nemeth at the University of Wisconsin, where he actually looked at the history of cost declines in solar panels, and actually only about a third of those declines were attributable to scale. Much of the rest of it was attributable to R&D, a number of other factors. So just going and buying a bunch more solar panels is not going to get you the kinds of cost declines that we've seen in solar panels even to date. And if you really want to accelerate that, then what you really need to start doing is really deploying on the very cutting edge of those capabilities so that you're using your deployment incentives to drive rapid improvements in the efficiency of solar panels, the conversion efficiency, and similarly with other technologies. So the critical concept here is we're not saying don't make any more investments in solar or wind or any other technologies. What we're saying is establish a baseline of what it costs now, and then use your deployment, rationalize the money that you're spending on deployment with actually demonstrable cost declines such that you're getting these technologies on a track where there's a reasonable expectation that at some point they are going to be able to compete with conventional energy sources without ongoing subsidies.
feedback on that as a proof of concept of this type of policy, ARPA-E, some of the loan guarantees that have been going out to new technologies.
Great. I mean, I can say something about it. It sounds like you know a bit too, so you should, if you have your own view of these, we'd love to hear it. I mean, I think we're big supporters of ARPA-E, so we propose tripling ARPA-E's or quadrupling ARPA-E's budget from its current $300 million to $1.5 billion. You know, in addition to the hubs, so we think that was very positive. I mean, I have to say I've heard very mixed things about the stimulus funding and R&D, and I think it'd be understandable why. You know, they were trying to, the goal of the stimulus was to get jobs created. They're trying to get money out the door as quickly as possible. So my understanding is that a lot of things got funding that maybe weren't even the kind of failures that were the kind of productive failures you wanted. And you know, it's too bad because the president had said when he took office that we've had a feast or famine attitude towards energy R&D over the last 3 decades, and he was going to change all of that. In fact, they just replicated it almost exactly. 2 years of, what did they, triple it or double it? Triple the R&D budget. And so, but these things take time, and so you have to have, it really needed to be a long-term program. I mean, that's why we were so critical of cap and trade, is we were like, you know, you're gonna, I mean, and they ended up with absolutely nothing. I mean, they could have invested that political capital into doing something that I think they could have gotten, you know, Republican support for, which is a long-term increase. It would have been much more limited than the expansive, you know, regulatory overhaul that cap and trade proposed, but I think it would have lasted and it could have had the kind of bipartisan support that things like NIH have. So I think we worry a little bit about it, and I think we have started to see some of the, you know, with Solyndra and Evergreen, started to see some of the consequences of those investments coming back to haunt us. I don't know if you guys want to say something more happy than me.
I don't have anything happier to say. I
Okay.
mean, you know, that fellow with Jeff Salmon we had breakfast with, remember at the beginning of the stimulus, he said, I don't know how we're going to spend this much money. He told me this in early 2009. So I don't know how
someone within the DOE. Basically.
Yeah, we went, it was a career guy.
Yeah.
Says, I don't know how we're going to spend this
Right.
much money. And that ended up being, and it's
Yeah.
gotten caught in the undertow of all the other stimulus controversies, unfortunately,
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah. But please, actually, before you go, are you working on a research project where you're looking at this, and do you have any insights for us? That's part of the reason we came. I mean, look, you know, we're, I mean, to be honest, you know, truthfully, it's like, we've been real careful not to say more than we feel pretty confident about, and even on this issue of how do you create competitive deployment, model after procurement, you know, we get all these nice invitations now to go to the Hill, and they'll be like, so now how exactly do you guys, how do you propose structuring that? And we're kind of like, we're waiting for next summer's fellows to come to help us to figure it out. But I don't know if you have thoughts or ideas for us.
Mine is less from now is from a previous life. I used to work at a technical university, and I was there at the time when this stuff started to hit. And at that point, I could have counted the number of energy-related researchers at our university on one hand.
Right.
And what it did is it not only provided them government funding, but stimulated corporate funding and stimulated interest from academia in general. And that's sort of a non-monetary benefit that will continue. They're hiring now for faculty in energy. There is excitement around energy research in the university.
Yeah.
And that's been real progress. But I agree that there's the short-term funding, the feast or famine is still quite a problem.
Yeah, I mean, I think the other thing is that we have had, there's sort of like, there's so many different players in the energy industry. I mean, there's the utilities, I think, which are much more sober about the challenges of moving away from fossil because they deal with it every day. And then there was a whole set of VCs like John Doerr, who's the famous funder of Google, the VC funder, and Vinod Khosla, and a whole set of guys who come in, and they were like, they as Ted, you know, Ted makes a great point. They thought that we were in like 1995, the IT world in 1995 in terms of energy. In fact, we were, you know, it was more like 1965, you know, that we are, you know, that like those guys, or as another friend of ours said, you know, it's like these guys, you know, woke up on third base and they thought they hit a triple in terms of their IT funding. They've all literally, the VCs who took Google and Netscape and Apple and all these big firms public and made literally billions of dollars themselves, they all really attributed that to just their own genius. You know, it was like, I saw an opportunity and whatever, and it was like they forgot that there was, you know, 30 years, 40 years of DoD investment in the underlying backbone of the new IT economy. The investments in the internet, the investments in microchips, and then they would say things like, "We just got to have a price on carbon, and then it'll all change." And we were like, "What was the tax on typewriters that motivated the computer revolution? I mean, did I miss that? You know, where was the tax on telegraphs?" And so I think they really did a disservice, and I think a lot of those guys are now losing their shirts because they didn't actually understand some of the basics of energy density. You know, they don't understand that why fossil is so dominant. You know, and I find this among the environmental movement in particular. There's this kind of idea that fossil fuels are dominant because of the fossil fuel lobby in Washington and all of the subsidies they get. They don't understand the basic, thermodynamics of these extraordinary fuels, or the basic geophysical properties of these fuels. And I think that hubris did a great disservice to really the long-term innovation challenge that we have.
Thanks.
Thank you.
There. My name's Jared. I'm a Master's of Engineering Management student over at Pratt School of Engineering. My question is regarding the subsidy reform. What kind of backlash do you see coming from the wind, solar, and ethanol industries? Because these are really people you want on your side, yet they've structured their businesses around these subsidies, and it could have a bad side effect for them.
Well,
maybe we don't want more.
I mean, I would just say, I think, well, certainly ethanol may be in a class of its own.
Sure.
Yeah, we don't want them on our side.
But I think that that the wind and solar guys have a hard landing coming. They don't need the Congress is not going to need post-partisan power to take a pretty big cut out of a lot of those subsidies. And I think those industry, you put that together with, the impact of all the budget austerity stuff in Europe, where a lot of the sort of support for those industries has been sustained over the last 20 years. And I just think that there's just going to have to be a serious, reconsideration of the viability of those industries, because I think ethanol has a particular, the ethanol lobby has a particular kind of foothold in, in the political economy that'll be probably harder to dislodge. But I think wind and solar will get potentially will get sort of flicked see those subsidies sort of flicked off pretty quickly, and I think they're gonna have to kind of start to think about what an alternate sort of path for a future for those technologies and those industries going to look like.
Yeah, and I would just add too, building on Ted's point. I mean, I think that we are in need of some really good energy entrepreneurs, not just on solar and wind, but also the small nukes guys, and we've met some of them, who get that the public good being served here is advanced energy technologies. That they need to stop dressing up their current energy technologies as the public good. Today's low-carbon energy technologies are only useful to us to the extent to which they are driving innovation for new technologies. Because at the prices that they're at right now, they cannot replace fossil energy, neither in the United States, where we are willing to pay a little bit more for energy, much less in places like China or India, where all the growth in energy consumption is going to come from. I mean, the world is going to triple its energy consumption over the next 40 or 50 years. So I think our view is, look, what is the public interest here? The public interest is in innovation, so let's buy the innovation. And if that means that we need to pay for the IP and give the IP away, we should do that. And I'm speaking for Breakthrough here because we haven't really talked through some of this with Steve. But you kind of go, it's like if you want to compete with China, then let's be purchasing innovation and let's become the drivers of innovation, because so far that's our advantage over China. They're quickly trying to take that. They're luring a lot of U.S. firms and European firms to China to set up their R&D shops there. But let's, if China's just going to reverse engineer everything, fine. Let's then go and our interest then should be to drive those technologies forward. We should be buying the advanced technologies, not just subsidizing more and more wind turbines that really aren't going to make any significant dent in overall energy consumption, much less global emissions.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Next.
See if I can speak into this here. Okay. I'm Matt Gentian, a dual degree student here at the Sanford School and the Nicholas School of the Environment. And my question was about the renewable and clean energy standards that are being talked about of late. And I'm wondering whether those policies would augment the clean technology plan, or is the clean technology plan a means of achieving what could be done in the policies as well?
I would just describe that as another cart in front of a horse, in front of that technology horse. I think that Steve may have a different view. I think we've been sort of mostly agnostic on the RES. We don't think it's going to sort of drive a real kind of, it's going to play the kind of technology forcing role that a lot of people imagine. Virtually all of the RES proposals around the country have pretty hard price caps on them that will quickly kick in and sort of allow for significant sort of opting out. The places where you're seeing sort of ostensible progress being made are places that start with huge installed bases of hydro and very substantial renewable resource bases for sort of starting to build out some wind and solar. But I think certainly Michael and I are pretty skeptical that this is going to kind of make a whole lot of difference in what the deployed base of renewables looks like. I think if you move to a clean energy standard versus a renewable energy standard, I think you'll get, depending on how you structure it, you may get some more nuclear ultimately if we can figure out how to actually start building plants again, and you may get more gas. But I don't think either construction will have much impact on the deployment of renewable energy technologies, and I think that's pretty consistent. Certainly, looking at the various congressional proposals that have been out there, that's pretty consistent with most of the analyses that have been done, which is that actually when you kind of really look at what the sort of anticipated BAU without the renewable standard is in terms of renewable deployment, it looks about the same as what's actually required by these standards. So there's a lot of kind of to-do made about something that one way or another pretty much looks like business as usual to us and to, I think, a lot of other observers.
Yeah, I guess I'd say, yeah, I'm not much impressed with them either. And it gets back to the point I was trying to make that, I understand why environmentalists are pushing the idea because cap and trade has hit the wall. The Clean Air Act regulations is either in its worst case going to be a really bad political knife fight, or in the best case, it's going to be a really slow-moving bureaucratic process because the Clean Air Act is a very slow-moving piece of legislation. And so now let's do the renewable portfolio standards, which we sort of had around in various forms. But again, I think that's the old way of thinking of let's pick a target, let's make it 15% of this state and so forth. And I don't think that gets you very far.
Okay, we've got.
Thank you.
I don't know if this is working. We have 3 more people asking questions, so we'll get you to go quickly and answer quickly.
And there's one up there too.
There's one upstairs. I'm sorry. We'll go
Hi.
You first, and then you 3, but we'll ask you to be short and sweet.
And we'll try to be short too. Yeah.
Thank you. My name is Vanessa. I'm also from Nicholas School, and my background is economics, so I'm really enjoying the debate over there. So my question is, when you look through the proposal, different grants and different technology, how do you formulate the question, including the environmental integrity and economic kind of prosperity and also sustainable development? How do you make assessment and make your own priority list? Which technology or which way to go that have the whole portfolio?
So I'm sorry, is your question how do you set up the investment portfolio and technologies?
Yeah, so like many different ideas. Yeah, how do you pick and choose?
Which technologies?
Exactly.
Okay.
Thank you.
You would ask a question like that right after we said we were going to be short.
Well, I mean, I think the big picture is that it gets back to what we were arguing, that this has to be disciplined by improvements in price and performance of these technologies, which is not how it's structured right now. So our view is that we should be making investments in a whole range of low-carbon technologies. So it's not just small nuclear, it's not just solar and not just wind, but it's a whole set of those technologies. And again, it's I mean, I don't want to downplay the subjective element to it, but I think, you know, as Steve has said, you know, we need death panels for technology programs that are not succeeding. And that's the idea. That's the sort of the big central idea of the kind of subsidy reform and the kind of innovation program that we need.
Just add one little thought on this. That I always say this. Some things go without saying, but the people who say that, like me, are big people because we marinate in these issues. But remember that in the climate dimension of all this, which is maybe the largest part, is we call this global warming, right? Well, it's a global problem, and you know, the United States is the richest country in the world, or once was the richest. Maybe we will be again. You know, we can afford a certain amount of what I call whole foods energy. You know, as we get richer, we buy more expensive food. We can afford some more expensive energy sources. Not a lot more expensive. I mean, that's why, you know, we can't do 50% wind, but 10%. Okay, fine. The problem is the rest of the world is not going to afford that. You know, India is not going to buy onto that, and China is going to do it to a very limited extent, as I've suggested. And that's why, at the end of the day, you have to get back to, you know, energy revolutions that are going to make mass-scale energy cheaper than fossil fuels. And say, you know, the sort of current ways of trying to think about this, we don't know how we're going to get there. I guess now we've been maybe implicitly and explicitly a little gloomy sometimes, but you know, it's your fellow Marty Hofert, who we're going to see at NYU on Thursday. You know, that Science Magazine article he wrote a few years ago that attracted so much attention on energy pathways. And normally I don't like these sort of generalizations, but this one I think is right. You know, between the Wright brothers at Kitty Hawk near here and Neil Armstrong stepping on the moon, 66 years. Now, I don't know if we're going to repeat that kind of spectacular performance in energy or not, but that is some reason to suppose that in saying that we can't see what the future is ahead on this, I think it would be foolish to suppose that you're not going to see some really big things happen. And we're trying to say, let's stop talking about windmills and renewable portfolio standards and small ball stuff, as the baseball people would say, and see if there isn't a way that we can really push this harder and faster. And I can't do much better than that. I'm sorry, I wish we could, but specifics. But it's...
Hi, I'm Molly Ward. I'm a joint degree between Sanford and the Nicholas School of the Environment. My question is about sort of how you see this influencing the international community. So can you see, should the proposal be accepted, do you see it influencing policies, the development of them in other countries, as well as the furthering of an international climate treaty? And also, would you see other systems that are already in place, like the EU ETS, switching to a more similar system to that in the US if it should be successful?
Yeah, I mean, I think, in brief, yes. And in fact, we think the international process is already going in that direction anyway. So, you know, there's still, you know, Japan in Cancun basically stands up and says, any future emissions reduction agreements we make are going to be under the auspices of the Copenhagen Accord as opposed to the Kyoto Accord. Everyone's still sort of, there's sort of still some kind of presumption that the Copenhagen Accord or the Cancun agreements are going to sort of result in some global binding emissions reduction agreement. But I think it's extremely unlikely, and that actually, if you really kind of look below that, where we are making progress is on sort of bilateral, multilateral agreements at the nation-state level, which are going to be, more along the lines of what's been called policies and measures. Sort of states in the context of these international agreements, making agreements to take particular steps, either jointly or individually, to start to change their energy economies and other parts of their, the forestry policies in particular ways, in some cases with support from other bodies or nations. But that's where this whole thing is going, and I think the kind of proposal that we're talking about around energy innovation and committing to really kind of accelerating technology innovation in the United States is pretty consistent with where I think the international process is going to go.
Didn't Armin, we were met this morning with Armin Cohen of the Clean Air Task Force from Boston. Didn't he say the International Energy Agency is going to do a survey of government, international government
innovation
policies, which I don't think they've ever done before. They've done, so that'll be an interesting piece of work.
Hi, my name is Jackie. I'm also a dual degree student with Nick School and the Policy School. And my question is regarding the oil import fees. Last time I checked, the 3 top countries from which we import oil are Canada, Mexico, and Saudi Arabia. So I'm wondering how NAFTA would play into this. Is it prohibited under NAFTA to tack on oil import fees from Mexico and Canada? And if so, would putting oil import fees on all the rest of the oil that we import, would that be enough money to fund this program?
That's a good question on the. I'm not sure about the trade question.
Is it GATT illegal, basically?
We'd have to ask a good trade lawyer about that. I'm not sure. But yeah, there is the variation that has come up, which is what would Canada and Mexico say? So we only want to put an oil import fee on mean oil, right? It's not anyway. Well, of course, the converse, is free associating a little bit. Is the part of the whole low carbon fuel standards is really an effort to try and block Canadian tar sands oil. Just hugely energy intensive to make, right? So I don't know about that, but I think the numbers, we've done the arithmetic on this, I forget what it is, but I think the basic answer, if you put the fee at some point.
It's a lot of money.
It's a lot, pays a lot of money.
But if you figure out if it's GATT illegal, will you just email us and let us know?
Right.
And then could you get a colleague from the law department as well to figure out how to get around that?
It's one of those, it's sort of one of those things like talking about a low carbon tax. Our point in this is, we're having to throw out, a bunch of different ways to pay for it. But at the end of the day, it's just all irrelevant until you decide that you want to do that. To do any of this, I think you're going to have to establish some reasonable bipartisan basis to sort of sustain a national commitment to energy innovation. And I think if you can establish that kind of commitment, we'll find a way to pay for it. And it may not be one of those things. It may be some combination of a couple or all of them, or something we haven't even, we didn't even suggest. But, my sense, and interestingly, that's when you looked actually in the final gasp to try to get a climate bill out of the Senate, the whole idea of a sort of single unitary kind of auction process really started to break down, and where you went to was sort of, sector by sector strategies to fund, to establish the carbon price. And I think, probably if you actually got that far along the line, what you'll be looking more at is sort of sector by sector strategies to kind of aggregate money, in many cases maybe even targeted back to the sector. There's lots of possibility there. But it all starts with, the starting point is actually, actually deciding that this is something that we really need to do.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm David Tucker, a Master's of Environmental Management student at the Nicholas School. And thank you very much, all of you, for coming tonight. My question's in 2 parts, but I'll be brief. First, I agree with you about the idea of increasing funding greatly for energy innovation. How did you arrive at the range that you're targeting there of $15 to $25 billion up from the current around 3? And the second part is, how do you build political feasibility behind this in the current, you've talked some about this, but in the current atmosphere of skepticism about taxes on energy and, budget deficits and things like that? Because it seems to me that the cap and trade program was not a tax. Some of those permits were going to be given away free to industry, and then industry could trade among themselves and use the market. And then the ways you're proposing to pay for this are, in one form or another, unambiguously taxes or fees. And so how do you have some confidence building measures to get support behind that? Thank you.
Do you want to do the $25 billion first, or?
Boy, I don't even know if I remember. We started, I think we
it was a bottoms up. It was actually a pretty
project
specific bottoms up. Like everything in there, we kind of looked at existing budgets. What are they doing? What's the, with like on ARPA-E, we actually compared that with the DARPA budget. On the Energy Innovation Institutes, that was really sort of pulled from an existing proposal that Brookings had developed with a fair amount of sort of careful analysis of kind of, to get a dozen or so hubs up and running around the country, what would be the cost, what would that cost? So all of it was really, we looked at, we had a specific proposal for doing DoD deployment of small nuclear, small nuclear designs, and really looked at, given the estimated cost of those designs, how much would it cost to procure 10 of each, enough that, someone could actually really get a proper operation up producing them. So it was all bottoms up. I think Michael or Steve may want to add something, but I think the argument that sort of cap and trade wasn't a tax requires an extremely literal reading of, cap and trade. What it demonstrated, I think, the sort of the issues is that you can sort of hide it. You can hide the economic costs associated with the program, but sooner or later, your opposition is going to point that out. And you can say, no, it's not a tax. We're going to give them away and whatever. But the reality is that every economic analysis, credible economic analysis that was done at the sort of macroeconomic level concluded that there were substantial costs. Those costs were actually much greater than anything that we're talking about in terms of spending on energy innovation. You're talking about, I believe it's something like $2 trillion over the first decade of the programs in costs that ultimately, one way or another, were going to get passed on to consumers, firms. Someone was going to pay for that. And giving the permits away for free didn't actually solve that problem. I don't know if you guys want to add something to that.
Well, I like to say that the whole mystery of the whole cap and trade business was, the central axiom of the environmental community was, we want to put a price on carbon, but the politicians said, fine, but we don't want any consumers to pay higher prices. And this is never going to be able to make this work. So you backload it and do all these gimmicks, and that was, backloading was the main way to get around that immediate problem. So fine, you get it in place. The second part of your question is I'm pretty gloomy about right now. The mood of my pals, I suppose you'd say, or the House Republican caucus especially, is against any hint of an energy tax or energy fee. I can see, though, two possible openings here that could come pretty quickly, actually. If we'd had $5 gallon gas last year, I can guarantee you that one of the most common Tea Party signs you would have seen was drill, baby, drill. If we may well be heading back to that kind of gasoline here within the next few months, who knows? The oil prices are a little mysterious right now. And maybe it's peak oil, maybe it's other things, who knows. But even, I think I can say this, even most Tea Party members of the House would understand that even if you aggressively drill in this country, you won't be energy independent. It's a dumb idea anyway, but never mind. And at that point, you begin to have a more serious conversation about, but we have to have a long-term plan for next generation energy. And that begins to open the door to something like what we're talking about, it seems to me. Second one would be there's a lot of talk, and Obama may mention tonight in his talk about fundamental tax reform. I think this is a glittering opportunity for both parties to prove they can work together. They actually agree on some pretty basic aspects of all this. As part of that, if you want to go to a tax code that's pro-growth, that lowers tax rates on investment and productivity, as Vice President Gore said, I think quite rightly a few years ago, and then moves to more consumption taxes, then suddenly an energy tax component of that becomes politically feasible. Maybe those are both dealing inside straights, but right now that's the only near-term political realities I can see that might make it move forward. Otherwise, I think we're looking at the next, not the next administration, but I think we're looking at the next cycle of Congress after the next presidential election, whether it means Obama's reelected and you have a new thing like you did with Clinton in the 90s where a lot of stuff happened, or whether it's a new president. Then it's going to be a reset on the political clock as well as reset on the energy clock, I hope.
I'd like to thank you for this extraordinarily civil discourse among those of you who don't necessarily agree with each other but have sought common ground, and we appreciate it. Thank you very much.